interesting unit today, or not unit, section. This is indirect proofs, and this is 5.1 if you want to follow along in your books. Now, you've done two-column proofs, you've done detour proofs, you've never done indirect proofs, obviously, and you might be wondering what they are. Let's start with our objective. Only objective is to be able to write indirect proofs. That's it. You might be saying to yourself, huh? What's an indirect proof? Well, your first clue that you have an indirect proof will be you'll have a given, all this stuff up here, and then your proof is going to have this symbol right here. Notice it says not congruent to. So angle B is not congruent to angle E. That means you have an indirect proof. So what do you do with that? How do you prove something is not congruent to something? Well, from that, and you always, and I want to emphasize this, always start with your proof, with an indirect proof. So you have two options. You can either assume that this is true, and that angle B is not congruent to angle E, or you can assume it's not true, and that angle B is congruent to angle E. Okay, so what I want you to do is always assume the negation, or the opposite. So whatever this says, do the opposite. It's always going to say something is not congruent to something, or something along those lines. Okay, but we are going to go with the opposite of that. So we're going to run with angle B is congruent to angle E. Okay, and now let's look at our givens. We're told that angle A is congruent to angle D, and that AB is congruent to DE. And remember, I said that we're going to assume that this is true here. So we're going to assume that angle B is congruent to angle E, which means that triangle ABC would be congruent to triangle DEF by angle side angle, which would mean that AC would have to be congruent to DF by CPCTC. Here's the problem. It's impossible because of this. In our given, they told us that AC is not congruent to DF, and that's a given, so there's no arguing that. That is what it is. So our assumption that angle B is congruent to angle E is false, and the only other option is that angle B is not congruent to angle E, because that's the only other possibility. Either it is or it isn't. And since we tried to prove that it is and it turned out that it can't be, that means that the proof, that's what's true. So you basically just proved that that's true. So that's how you do it. It's kind of an interesting concept. You're still doing a proof, but you're switching it up. And notice I did this in this is called a paragraph proof, where you kind of write it out like this instead of the two-column one. You can do the two-column one if you want. That's fine. But I wanted to show you another way of doing things. Okay. So here's a procedure for doing an indirect proof. First, list the possibilities for the conclusion, or the quote-unquote proof. Assume that the negation of the desired conclusion is correct. Then you write a chain of reasons, or a two-column proof if you want, until you reach a conclusion that can't be true. This is going to be a contradiction of either information that's given, or a theorem, definition, or other known fact. Okay, and we'll probably get to some of those in class, so if you have questions, let me know. The example I'm going to show you is going to be another one where it contradicts something in the given. And finally, state that the remaining possibility is the desired conclusion. Okay? So let's take a look at another example. We are given that segment RS is perpendicular to segment PQ, and that segment PR is not congruent to segment QR. So I would have to get rid of that. So let's do that. And we need to prove that ray RS does not bisect angle PQR. So again, we start with our first step. Either ray RS bisects PQR, or ray RS does not bisect PQR. since our proof says does not bisect, we're going to go with that it does bisect. So we assume that it does, and we can then say that this would be congruent to this. And since RS is perpendicular to PQ, we know that this angle is congruent to this angle. And then everyone's favorite thing, because you all know it so well, we can say that SR is congruent to itself because of the reflexive property, which would mean we have an angle, a side, and an angle, and we could say that triangle QSR is congruent to triangle PSR by angle side angle. What's the problem with that? Okay, that would mean that segment PR and segment QR would have to be congruent by CPCTC, which contradicts this right here. Okay, and since it contradicts that, the assumption is false. Okay, ray RS cannot bisect angle PQR. So finally, state that what we're trying to prove is in fact true, and the only other possibility, ray RS does not bisect PQR, is the only other possibility. Hopefully that makes sense. I know it can be a little confusing, but it's a little bit different than our typical proofs, so that's kind of nice, switching it up a little bit for you. But if it does confuse you, please do me a favor and kind of give me an idea as to where we lost you at what step, and ask right away during class when I see you next, and we'll get everyone on the same page and get it straightened out.